Greetings and salutations, Greek students. We continue our study of how to do word studies or lexical analysis by looking at another example from the New Testament, a contested example. Here I want to draw our attention to the language of leadership that we see in the New Testament, and I draw our attention to the specifics of some texts. In many churches, the language of the New Testament is adopted to prescribe leadership offices. So famously, for example, we have the role of the overseer or the bishop, the episkopos, or the elder, the presbyteros, and the deacon, diakonos. Recently, a church asked me to come and give a talk explaining what the scriptures say about elders, and specifically whether or not women can be elders. This is, of course, a loaded question, and it presumes, among other things, that what we can do is take these New Testament words, particularly the role or the word elder, and describe a specific church office. I think careful study of the language of the New Testament shows that, at least when the New Testament is written, these words do not describe specific offices or roles, but are general leadership terms. So the language is fluid. In some passages describing church leaders, there's no mention of episkopoi or presbyteroi or diakonoi, right? There's no overseers, bishops, elders, or deacons. In Ephesians 4:11, Paul instructs that God gives apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and elders for the leadership of the church in Ephesians 4:11 through 16. But if overseers, elders, and deacons were these defined specific offices, why would Paul not mention them? Moreover, other passages conflate the language of leadership so that elders, presbyteroi, are tasked with shepherding and overseeing, as we see in 1 Peter 5-11, as well as Acts 20:17-38. So in addition to the flexibility of leadership language, overseer, elder, and deacon are relatively rare. So what I want to do is look at how they actually get used in the New Testament, not just in the New Testament, but then go into what we see happening in the second century, in the reception of this language, and see why these words become assumed to reflect specific offices, and see that the language of the New Testament doesn't necessarily have these fixed offices, but that it sort of begins this trajectory. The noun overseer, episkopos, only 5 times in the New Testament. So this is the word where overseer usually is translated as overseer or bishop, the episkopos. Those are the references. Like in many cases, this word is conflated. So like 1 Peter 5:1-11, and the author of Acts conflates the overseer, the episkopos, with the elder. So to the Ephesian elders in Acts 20:17, Paul says, "Keep watch over yourselves and over the flock which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, episkopous." So here, the elders are described as doing the work of overseeing. Similarly, in 1 Peter 5, you see Paul describing the overseer as shepherding. When Paul writes to the Philippians, he addresses the overseers and the deacons in Philippians 1:1. 1 Timothy 3:2, Paul provides a list of the characteristics of an overseer, which in most churches, the list functions as qualifications for an elder, even though the language of qualification appears nowhere in the text of 1 Timothy. Peter describes Jesus as the shepherd and overseer of your souls in 1 Peter 2:25. The language for elder, much more frequent in the New Testament, 66 times, although most of these uses refer to the leaders in the city of Jerusalem in the Gospels. And then in Acts, this is specifically the Jewish leadership. And then in the book of Acts, elder can refer to the local leaders in churches. For example, the Jerusalem church. Paul appoints elders in Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch in Acts 14. There's elders in Ephesus. In Paul's letters, the word for elders occurs only in 1 Timothy and Titus, where Paul instructs male and female elders in 1 Timothy 5:1-2, as well as Titus 2:2-5. Now, what's interesting is that when the feminine form of this word appears, it's not translated as elder, it's translated as older woman. And you can imagine why that might be the case. The language of deacon, a general term for a servant, 29 times in the New Testament. So Jesus describes those who are great and leaders in his kingdom as servant of all. Paul describes himself, as well as other early Christian leaders, as servants. They're Paul, Apollos, Tychicus, Epaphras, overseers and servants in Philippi and Timothy. In 1 Timothy 3, Paul provides a list of characteristics appropriate to an overseer, which very much mirrors the characteristics of an elder in Titus 1:5-9. So And Peter similarly combines these and other leadership terms to elders in 1 Peter 5, 1 through 11 on how to shepherd while overseeing in 1 Peter 5, 2. So you can sort of see how this list functions, and I'm going to post this so you'll have access to it. After the New Testament, according to a letter from Clement, an overseer in Rome in the first century, there was a sedition against the local elders, the presbyteroi. So there's Clement is the episcopoi in the city of Rome. This is near the end of the first century, and there's this division against the local presbyteroi, the elders of the church in Corinth, according to First Clement. Ignatius of Antioch is an overseer, an episkopos, usually translated a bishop. And he writes a series of letters to nearby churches as he travels to Rome, where he will be martyred. And one of the themes of those letters is the unity and appropriate authority structure of the church. So Ignatius places elders, presbyteroi, under the local overseer, bishop, or episkopos. He writes, "For as much as I was permitted to see you in the person of Damas, your godly bishop, episkopos, and your fellow elders, presbyteros, Bassus and Apollonius, and my fellow slave, Sundulos, the deacon, diakonos, Zodion, who I enjoy because he is subject to the bishop, the episkopos, as to the grace of God and the council, the presbyterion, a nominative form for elders, the group of elders, the presbyteroi, as unto the law of Jesus Christ." Again, in the Magnesians, this letter to the Magnesians, "It's fitting for you not to take advantage of the youth of the bishop, but according to the power of God the Father, to show him all respect, just as I have learned. Also the holy elders have not exploited the youthful appearance, but as for one prudent in God, permit him, though not to him, but to the Father of Jesus Christ, to the bishop of all." So here, Ignatius imagines the authority of the structure of the church as God/Jesus is like the bishop, the apostles are like the elders, and the deacons are the service of the church. That's quite a bold theological claim, that the leader, the episkopos, the bishop, is likened to God himself, and the apostles are likened to the elders. So what does all this mean for thinking about leadership roles of women in the New Testament? There is clear evidence that women served in a variety of leadership and ministry capacities in early Christianity, including several named women who worked alongside Paul, Prisca or Priscilla, Phoebe, Junia, Appia, Chloe, Euodia, and Syntyche. Paul portrays himself as doing women's work in his ministry. And then there are other passages that seem to limit the role of women in church leadership. The veiling passage in 1 Corinthians 11, the exhortation to silence in 1 Corinthians 14, as well as the command not to teach in 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 15. So how does all this relate to the larger question that this church asked me of, should women be elders in the church? Well, one of the difficulties of that question is it takes a New Testament word that is fluid and has lots of different applications for leadership in the New Testament, and it assumes that it's a particular office. And the challenge is that, yes, this term by the second century is used to describe specific offices, but that hierarchy of the monarchical bishop that we see in Ignatius is not operative in the New Testament text. And so one of the challenges that we come up against when we try to use these New Testament Bible words to talk about specific roles in our church or in the church where we happen to attend is that what we're doing is we're saying, oh, we have this Bible word and that's a thing in our church. But the specific office in our church is much more clearly defined often than what the Bible word is. And so this becomes a difficult task of thinking about, okay, what does leadership look like in our community? And what are the qualifications of that leadership? And asking that question, do those qualifications get filled by people who are male or female, and how does that operate in our context? So I bring this up simply to talk about when we have these New Testament words, it's really useful to look at them, but we can't just appeal to the New Testament and say, well, this word shows up here and it looks like this, because it's often a bit more complicated and there's a lot of nuance going into it. And here I think specifically of the question of whether or not there could be male and female elders. Well, technically, 1 Timothy 5, 1 and 2, there are the presbyteros, older men, and presbyteros, older women. Same exact word, the masculine and feminine forms, but that gets translated differently because there's this kind of imported assumption that elders, presbyteroi, are male, but you can have older women. So this relates to larger questions that we have about thinking about the roles of men and women in leadership and what that looks like in local church practice, and wanting to, I think rightfully, wanting to take the New Testament seriously to be guidance towards what that practice looks like, while at the same time sometimes acting as though the New Testament is more clear about exactly what those roles are than it actually is. So these are examples of thinking about not just paying attention to the literary context of the New Testament, but also recognizing what we bring to the text as we study these words and the assumptions that we have about what church leadership should look like based on our own experience and practice through tradition.